Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Red Ride Podcast. My name is Peter.
And my name is Dan.
And we have the privilege of taking a look at the first section of Hebrews 3, where we will be exploring why Jesus is greater than Moses.
Sounds like an interesting section, Pete.
It definitely is. And what have you thought of it so far?
Are you talking about Hebrews or chapter 3?
Well, chapter 3, I think. Or even just Hebrews, you know.
Okay. Let's start with Hebrews and then I can double down on chapter 3.
Yeah.
Not double down, that's the wrong expression. You know what I mean, though. So Hebrews, I think, has been really cool that we've been able to do a deeper dive.
Yeah.
Often, I guess you just read a book of the Bible, and then you're like, cool, read the book, move on to the next one. Or maybe I glean some like really cool, insightful things that God is teaching or showing, or in my devotions, like guiding me and helping form Christ-likeness in me. But I don't think I often do a deep dive into a book. And so that has been really cool with this, that we've just been able to spend extended time in the book. So now as we look in chapter 3 specifically, I think what's been cool is this theme that the author of Hebrews has been showing us how has really been honing in on Jesus.
Yeah.
And then all these other characters or character types that are around, just consistently showing how Jesus is the focal point of our faith.
Yes.
And now we look in Jesus and Moses, and we see how Jesus is greater than Moses, and we're going to dive into that a little bit in just a moment.
Yeah.
And I just think it's an amazing thing because, as we will establish later, Moses was a really big deal for the Jewish people.
Absolutely.
He comes through him, God establishes the law. And so effectively, the way in which the Israelites live and exist and relate to each other, relate to foreign nations, all of that is because Moses gave them the laws. Well, God through Moses gave them the laws.
Absolutely.
So their whole culture is effectively developed from this one guy who is this mediator or this intercessory person who communicates from God to the people what needs to happen.
Yes.
So now the author's like, okay, cool. Moses is there, but now I want you to see Jesus as someone who's far greater than that.
Yes.
And I think that's really cool.
I agree with you, and probably just off the script because it's not in the script, but you know what is quite fascinating is that we can't tell you everything about Hebrews in this podcast because it'll take. but we do spend a lot of time looking at various, and we don't actually finish. We realize that there's so much more to look into.
Yep.
And because there's just so much in there, and that's why we invite you to not just to take this podcast as like a trailer to.
Oh, that's a good way to say it. Yeah.
As a trailer to Hebrews 3, so you're like, okay, cool. Let me go and dive in, and we are going to be talking about Jesus being greater than Moses. I'm going to highlight something which I thought was really cool. And in verse 1, the writer says, "Holy brothers, you who share in the heavenly calling, consider Jesus." And I love the fact that he says holy brothers, because he's not saying that because they've achieved holiness. He's saying that because they're holy, because they've received by faith, they've put their faith in Jesus. And because they've put their faith in Jesus, they have been made holy. And that's what they can be called, holy brothers. So it's a status that they have, not because they have earned anything, but it's because of what Jesus has done. Also, there's a share in a heavenly calling. There's this calling, just like God called Abraham out of the land of the Chaldeans to possess the land, to get to go to a land that he would give to his descendants to possess, just like the people in the scriptures were called out of something. God calls us out of darkness into his light. And so we share in a heavenly calling, and that heavenly calling is that one day we will be made like Jesus. We will have eternal life. We will get to share in the inheritance that is being kept in heaven for us. So we share in that calling, and I love that because that sets us up for us considering Jesus.
Yeah.
For us thinking carefully about Jesus, for us meditating on Jesus, the apostle, because an apostle was someone who was sent. So Jesus was sent by God, the original apostle sent by God on a mission to save the lost. So he's the only apostle that did what no other human can do. We are only doing what we are only apostles, not apostles in the sense of like John and Peter and them, but in a sense of being sent out by God to tell people about what Jesus did. And Jesus is our high priest, which we will look at much more later. So, consider him who was faithful to God who appointed him. God appointed him as an apostle and appointed him as a priest, and Jesus did everything that God required of him. Now, the writer assumes that the readers knew who Moses was, which is why he doesn't give us any history of who Moses is, because the assumption is that I'm writing to the Hebrew believers, they will know. So that's why he just simply says to them that Moses is greater, and he tells them why. For us, we're gonna not assume that of you. We don't know who. We want you to know. We won't tell you everything about Moses, but we will give you a sort of an outline of who Moses was, and then we will explain to you why Jesus is better than him and what that means for us.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So shall we dive in?
Let's do that.
So, Moses is a famous person in Jewish history because he is the one that God used to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt where they were slaves. He is said to be the greatest prophet Israel had ever had. Can you imagine having that as on your CV? You know, Daniel, the greatest youth leader Red Writers ever had.
That's funny.
There was no other prophet who enjoyed nearness with God like Moses. It was said of him that he spoke to God, or God spoke to him as a person speaks to a friend. Can you imagine having that kind of intimacy with God, where God speaks to you like a friend?
Yeah.
That is crazy.
It's really profound.
And it was through Moses that God set up the laws that would be used to govern or to rule the nation of Israel. And it was through Moses that God set up a system that would pave a way for people to be able to come near to him, which is to come near to God. On top of that, Moses was the man that God used to part the Red Sea. It was through Moses that God used water to come out of a rock. And there were many more incredible things that God did through Moses, like manna from heaven, quail.
That's right.
And when Israel wrote the Psalms and songs, and the prophets look back at history, they would look back to see the great things that God had done, the ultimate work of salvation that God had worked. They would always look back to the time where God used Moses. So I would encourage you guys to read Moses and read the book of Exodus if you would like to get to know Moses a bit more, because God used him to do some exceptional things. In Jewish history, he is a big deal. He was, and in many ways, he still is a big deal amongst the Jewish people. And he was such a big deal that if any person in Jewish history rejected the laws he had written, they suffered the death penalty.
That's crazy.
It's insane. So I mean, to say the least, the Jewish people took his writings seriously.
Very seriously. I mean, the death penalty is crazy.
No, oh my God.
But yeah, I mean, it makes sense, I suppose, because here is this nation that is being established, and Moses, I suppose, at the spear front or the arrowhead of that establishing or developing of this Israelite nation, out from slavery from the Egyptians, delivered through the Red Sea, and then going to inherit the promised land, which that generation obviously doesn't do, and you can find more about that in the early books like Exodus. And I just think it sets up, Moses helps set up all of what we read in the Old Testament, right? Yeah. I mean, that is a pivotal moment in Jewish history. Yeah. And so it makes sense that he's a pivotal figure in Jewish history when we read in the laws. But the author of Hebrews now goes on to say that Jesus is greater than Moses. Yeah. Number one, I think that would be a pretty bold claim. Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm not saying that's why maybe he's anonymous in this book. No, that's a joke. That's a joke. But to say that someone was greater than Moses to a Pharisee, to a scribe, to even a normal, working class Jewish man or woman would be this expression, or this shock would come upon them because they just immediately could not believe you, because here you're saying someone else is greater than the person who established our effectively government laws, how we just interact with one another. How can this be, I suppose?
And without Moses, you'll still be in slavery.
Yeah,
basically.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's this huge disbelief that would come upon these people if they had to read the beginnings of chapter 3, where in the early verses, the author's just so Jesus is greater honor than Moses.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay, but why? And that's what we're going to get into now.
Absolutely.
So I'm really excited for that. Pete.
Let's look at it. If you go, for example, and look at Moses, you'll see, let's first pay attention to Moses because we know that Moses was great. So we want to look at some of the things that Moses, he wasn't perfect, but the writer is not concentrating on his imperfection. So if you go and read his story, you'll find that, that even though he took the Israelites out of Egypt, he failed to take them into the promised land.
Right.
But that's not...
that's not the focal point of what we are speaking about here, or what the author is speaking about.
Absolutely.
So
if you go and look at Moses, you will see that this man was faithful to do everything that God had commanded him to do. So all those laws and systems put in place were not from Moses. We just need to clarify that.
He was more just the spokesperson of those.
Absolutely. That's why he's named a prophet.
He's
called a prophet because prophets were like God's spokesperson. So Moses received them from God and then passed them on to the people and put those systems and laws in place to ensure that the people followed everything that God commanded them to do. So Moses was faithful to God in doing all of that, but that is where it ends. His faithfulness was only as a servant.
Right.
Jesus, on the other hand, was faithful as a son. The difference between a servant and a son is that the son owns the house because the son is the rightful heir.
That's right. The servant has no right to the house. Yeah?
Imagine your parents are like...
My dad, in his will, he's not going to say, well, you don't have a servant, but you wouldn't say, I don't know, say he I suppose owned a business or something like that.
Yeah.
And I worked in the business, and then there was someone else who also worked in the business.
Yeah.
I mean, naturally speaking, I would be the rightful heir to inherit the business from my dad as his son if my dad was the one who established the business, not someone else. I mean, this is in an ideal world, I suppose. Obviously, stuff happens in real life. But by default, or if we speak naturally, that's what would happen.
Absolutely.
Moses, as you said, and as the scriptures say, faithful servants. Jesus, the rightful heir, as a
Yes.
son.
Absolutely. And Moses was faithful in God's house as a servant, but Jesus is faithful. So notice we are highlighting Jesus is faithful because, like you said, in the natural world, sometimes sons are not faithful. you
Yeah.
know? But here, Jesus is faithful in God's house as a son. So when the writer talks about a house here, he's talking about the people of God. So the house in this in Hebrews 3 refers to the people of God, and Moses was entrusted to take care of God's people. And as a servant, he was not the builder of the house. God built his house through calling Abraham, right?
Yeah.
Remember, he said that he would make Abraham into a great nation, and he would do that miraculously. Abraham could not produce child through Sarah by his own capacity.
Yeah.
So here God was the architect and the builder, and Moses was entrusted with that.
Yeah.
And now Jesus continues the legacy by building the house, and we are God's house. So Jesus is building his kingdom, but he's also looking after the house.
Yeah.
The servant can only do what the owner wants to be done in the house. That's the difference. So Moses can only do what God wants to be done, while the owner can do whatever he wants with the house.
It's his house.
Absolutely.
He can do with it what he deems necessary and what pleases him.
Yeah. And that is who Jesus is.
Mm.
He is the owner, and that's what makes him greater than Moses. What are you thinking, Daniel?
I'm thinking this is a lot more complex than a 15-minute conversation, which I suppose is what we're trying to encourage you guys to do, as I take a little tangent here, is for you to go and read the stuff for yourselves. As much as we can talk about some stuff, really, we are only touching the surface. We're brushing past things in order to hopefully get your taste buds revving for more, for something deeper, to go deeper into the scriptures. I think if you do, God would reveal things to you that would blow your mind away, and that would just make you have this greater love for the scriptures and who God is. And so that's what we're trying to do. I hope that makes sense.
I agree. And definitely makes sense to me. So
all right, so we just mentioned Jesus as the rightful heir, the owner of the house, and Moses as a servant of the house. Moses can only do what the owner of the house requires or deems necessary to further build the house, and he's faithful in that. Jesus, the faithful one to continue to build the house, the designer, the architect. So I think what we just need to clarify here is often, at least in our modern day understanding of the word servant, we sometimes think of it as a degrading term, someone who's of a lower class.
yes.
Does that make sense?
That's true, yeah, because there's also the history associated with
Yes.
American slavery, the brutality of it.
Yeah.
We think of, we hear stories of trafficking, and slavery in that context can be very, very bad. And even back then, it was also bad, but and servant as well can sometimes sound very degrading. But here, there's a different Greek word that's used to describe Moses here as the servant.
Yeah.
It's not the one that we normally attribute to a slave. It is the one that refers to a high-ranking person, official, someone of nobility. So here, Moses is referred to. We think of someone, for example, who serves the king in a higher position.
Yeah.
I don't know, like the king's advisor or something.
Yeah.
I mean, not that Moses was God's advisor.
No, for sure. But the idea is in a similar principle in that person has high honor in the court standings in the kingdom. They have high honor. If you had to see them walking the streets, you'd be like, oh, that's a king's official. He has high honor in the king's courts.
Yes.
But who has higher honor? The Son.
Son, absolutely.
So Jesus has higher honor in this picture that is being painted by the author.
Yeah.
It's not degrading Moses. It's not saying that he's, I don't know, this terrible human being or he's like, whatever. It's just saying he has high honor, but who has higher honor? God's own Son.
Yes.
And I think that's a point of clarification and something just to take note of in our minds.
Yeah.
Moses is not greater than Jesus here.
Yes.
Right? Jesus is the one who is greater.
Absolutely. Daniel, I get very excited. I was just getting so excited when I was hearing that. I was like, yes, preach it. And you know, what is interesting to note is that what all that Moses did in service to God served a purpose. You know, sometimes, and we'll get to that later. We're not going to jump the gun. But what we can say is that what Moses did served the purpose of pointing to Jesus.
Yeah.
So Moses is, all the things that Moses did not point back to him.
Points to Jesus.
It points to Jesus. And with Jesus, it's different though.
Yeah.
Because everything that he does points back to him. It is so that if you read the book of John, John writes, he says that we're writing these things, all the things that Jesus did, he did so that you might believe that he is the Son of God. Moses doesn't do all of these things so that you might believe that he is God. He points away. In fact, he even talks about another prophet who will arise, that you must listen to him. And it's pointing always towards Jesus. So even the sacrificial system set up by Moses was designed to point forward.
How beautiful is that, hey?
That is amazing.
It's so cool. Like all of what had been established was this prelude to the coming of Jesus. And I think that's really special. And then Jesus comes. And then we get to see the ultimate sacrifice, the one that would be paid for all mankind's sins, not just even the Israelites' sins, all of mankind.
Sure.
And here it was Moses alluding to this 2,000 years prior, something along like that.
Something somewhere.
It's quite profound to just begin to see how God is writing this narrative throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament and even into our lives today. And here we just having this look at Moses, at Jesus, and how Jesus has got the greatest honor. So what does that mean, Pete? Like, why do we need to know this? I think is a good question to ask.
I think the best thing first to do is to look at the people of Israel. Why was it necessary for the people to know that Jesus was greater than Moses? And I think for us, this is not the only reason. I encourage you to go and look at it. But as I've been thinking about this, I realized that there's a danger that exists in all of us to elevate people in our minds to higher positions than what is necessary. So we may look at people around us who are amazing, who we think are amazing, and they probably are, because they are good at something or are incredible people, and we sometimes, without knowing, give them God status. We don't do it consciously, but in somewhere in our minds, we elevate them. You look at the leaders who clashed with Jesus. If you look at them, for example, and you read, like for example, in this one place that stood out to me where Jesus says, Moses in whom you put your hope in.
Wow.
And that was crazy. They began to put their hope in Moses more than in God. It was all about what Moses said, forgetting that the person who was the owner of the message was not Moses. It was God who was the owner of the message. And Moses was just a messenger. So the owner of the message was there, Jesus, when he arrived, because Jesus arrived on the scene. And when he himself was there, who Moses wrote about, they could
Sure.
not recognize him. They missed him. And I think sometimes because we have people in our world who maybe have done some incredibly respectable things or have done some wonderful things, we can sometimes give them this God status
Yeah.
where what they say goes, rather than, or we begin to live our lives around them. And the danger is, and that's why I love our church leaders, is that they don't point towards themselves,
Yeah.
they point away from themselves, which I think enables us as a community to be in a healthy space. But it's been interesting, even for me when I was growing up, when I was at a previous church, sometimes when you needed to be prayed, you wanted to go out for prayer, you hoped that the preacher who
Yeah.
preached the message was the one who prayed for you, because because in your mind you're thinking by some interesting way, it's only through them that God's power would come.
Their prayers might be more effective or something like that. Yeah.
And that is just a little example. But how many of us sometimes we are hoping for this one person or this one thing, and when that thing doesn't come through, or if that person fails, then all hope is lost.
Yeah.
Like the disciples like the man who came to Jesus begging Jesus to cast out the demons, because he said, I've asked your disciples, and they tried, but they couldn't. And now suddenly he's like, man, there is, he was like, if the disciples can't do it, then who else can,
Yeah.
And that's why I think he had to pray, and he said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Yeah.
And I think it was good, because from there, the disciples and the man had to realize who their hope was in.
Yeah.
Not their own ability, not the ability of the disciples, but the ability of Jesus to actually, and I think sometimes we ceiling God because we look at people's ability, and if people's ability hits a certain limitation, then that means that God can't.
Yeah, that's true. We do
God
do
has
that.
reached the end of it, So yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe some closing thoughts is that the power of Jesus is through the Holy Spirit is with us now.
Yeah.
Is with me, is with you, Pete, whoever's listening. Yeah. We've got that power or that ability to impact lives, to pray for situations, to bring forward and push forward the kingdom of God. All of that is with us. It's not like we're hoping in Moses for those things to come and happen.
Yeah.
It's in Jesus that our hope is placed. And I think whatever your situation is, it's Jesus is the one that affects it.
Yes.
So maybe it's a really dark and dire situation and you feel like there's no hope. Jesus is the one who can bring light into that situation. Jesus is the one who can, it says in the Psalms how he draws you out of deep waters, and then he places you in the spacious land or the ground.
Yeah.
And I think it's Jesus the one who does that in our lives. And I know certainly, you were mentioning how they focused on the messenger, but missed the one who the message was all about.
Yes.
I certainly don't want to miss the one who the message is all about.
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm taking away from that this morning, is that when God is revealing stuff to me, I wouldn't focus on the preacher. I wouldn't focus on the awesomeness or the amazingness of these leaders around me. And that's not to, again, degrade them or diminish what they're doing, but it's just say they're all pointing to the one upon whom our hope eternally rests. And I don't want to miss that person, Jesus. I don't want to miss him. And I'll appreciate the guys who are speaking about him because they reveal more things to me that I might have missed before by myself. But they are all only pointing to one man, and his name is Jesus. And I trust you don't miss him, because I know that he is deeply affectionate for you and concerned about you. And I know that he loves you. Yeah.
And guys, with that, we end. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Pete.
Have
Cheers,
a-
guys.
Cheers.